Good morning, sir.
Morning.
This morning we're going to hear from Mr. Staunton.
I swear by my Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Can you give your full name, please?
My name is Henry Eric Staunton.
Mr. Staunton, you should have in front of you a witness statement dated the 6th of September of this year. Do you have that in front of you? It should be behind tab A of your bundle.
Yes,
Could I ask you please to turn to page 83?
yes,
Can you confirm that that is your signature?
it is.
And can you confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is true to the best of my knowledge and belief.
Thank you very much. That witness statement has the unique reference number of WITN 1140100, and that will be uploaded onto the inquiry's website in due course. By way of background, you qualified as a chartered accountant, is that right?
Correct.
You worked at Pricewaterhouse, PwC for 23 years, including as partner.
It was Pricewaterhouse all the time that I was there, but yes.
Thank you. You became executive director of Granada Group and ITV, and in that position you worked for a further 12 years, is that right?
Correct. They were both FTSE 100 companies.
You became a non-executive director and chairman of a number of other companies thereafter. Just by way of example, you were chairman of Ashtead, a plant hire company, is that right?
Correct.
W.H. Smith, the well-known retailer.
Correct.
Capital and Counties, which was a property company.
Correct.
And Phoenix, which was a life insurance company.
And I was also deputy chairman of Legal & General, which is the biggest investor in British business.
Thank you. Can you assist us?
Can I just say I'm also chairman of my old school and chairman of the advisory board of Exeter University Business School, where I was at.
Thank you. Can you assist us with how you were approached for the role of chairman of the Post Office, please?
Well, I was looking forward to a happy and fruitful retirement on the golf course, and I was approached to consider this, and I initially said no, but they said, look, it's time for you to put something back, Henry. Please think about this seriously. So I did, and I took the role on.
And who is they?
The headhunters liaising with DVT.
Mr. Parker had left on the 30th of September of 2022, and I think you've said in your statement that you began informally shadowing Mr. Tidswell from the 1st of October 2022, is that right?
That's correct. I was leaving W.H. Smith at the end of October, and I didn't feel it was right to be. It's a strategic partner, W.H. Smith, of the Post Office, and I thought it was very unlikely there'd be any conflicts, but for the avoidance of doubt, I started 2 months later.
Thank you. It was nominally a role for 2 days a week. Was that the amount of time you spent in that role?
It was considerably more.
Did you anticipate that it would be considerably more?
No, I didn't.
Was it simply because of matters relating to the inquiry, matters relating to the historic fallout from the scandal that's well known to this inquiry, or do you think it's something more than that that would require the time commitment that you did?
It was more than that, because I thought the place was a mess and it required much more of my time.
In terms of the briefings that you received when you took on the role, did you receive briefings into the historic actions against sub-postmasters concerning alleged discrepancies when you first joined?
Yes, I was.
And what was your initial impression of the attitude of the business towards those matters?
My initial impression was, and I'm no lawyer, but I thought it seemed obvious to me that the Horizon system was completely and utterly unreliable, and thus I was staggered that the postmasters had these issues to deal with in respect of their relations with the Post Office. That was my single biggest reaction from the whole of my briefing in those 2 months.
And what was your initial reaction as to how seriously or otherwise the business took that issue?
I felt that people thought Justice Fraser's analysis, they didn't fully accept it, was my impression, that somehow the case hadn't been put well or whatever, that there wasn't a feeling that this was absolutely wrong as to what had happened.
And where in the business was that impression coming from, in your view?
Well, it was outside. It was not just within legal or remediation. I think it was a feeling across the piece with the team.
We will get in due course to your meeting with the permanent secretary, but what was your initial impression of the attitude of UKGI and the Department for Business in respect to those matters?
I couldn't say, because I hadn't met anyone until I met Miss Mumby, and we didn't really talk about the sort of issues that we're talking about here in any length. So it would be speculation on my part.
And you've addressed the Horizon system. What about compensation and redress? What was your initial impression of the business's attitude towards compensation and redress?
Well, my initial impression was that I thought the Post Office and the government were dragging their feet in terms of making payments for remediation in the first place. And in the second place, I thought that in respect of, there was no appetite at all for exoneration. Those were the two things that came through strongly to me.
What did you understand to be the role of the investigations department when you first joined?
My understanding was that they were very powerful, that if you heard about some of the issues in respect of how they dealt with postmasters, it came over to me as quite brutal, really.
And we're talking about your initial impressions?
Yes.
At the very beginning?
Yes.
You didn't have any background in, for example, liaising with law enforcement?
No, I've never been involved in a situation. I've got to be honest, I've never had any involvement with a situation like this before in my business life.
Do you recall any discussions or briefings early on in your time as chair with regard to the role of the investigations department and, for example, criminal prosecutions?
No, not in any great detail. I mean, it was an overview to start with in those 2 months. If we're talking about those 2-month period, no, I would say not.
I want to move on to your initial tasks and initial information that you became aware of. And I'm going to start with a letter to your predecessor from the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Business and Trade. Could we please turn to UKGI 000-44315? This is a letter from Sarah Mumby, Permanent Under-Secretary of State, to your predecessor, Mr. Parker. And that sets out the strategic priorities for 2022/2023. And I'll just spend a few moments going through some of the key points in this letter. If we scroll down, please, it sets out that each year there is a letter to the Post Office which sets out the key priorities. First, it has a heading shareholder priorities. And if we keep on scrolling, please, it says at the bottom, specifically, I'd like you to focus on the following priorities. 1, maintaining and improving Post Office's capacity, capability, and resilience at all levels of the organisation. If we scroll down, we can see 2, engaging with the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry and implementing change. Number 3, resolving historical litigation issues. And I'll just read out some of those priorities that are set out there in bullet points. It says, for the financial year 22-23, the Post Office should build on the successes of the historic shortfall scheme and the lessons learned to ensure effective progress on the other compensation areas. Deliver the historic shortfall scheme timetable with our ambition for 100% of offers made by the end of 2022 and progressing claims through to the post-offer process. Continuing to work closely with officials to progress the timely delivery of compensation to postmasters with overturned historical convictions. Work with officials on issues relating to group litigation order compensation. Identify and deliver compensation to postmasters that have suffered detriment not captured within the other areas. And finally, challenge post office management so their activities are reflective of our shared objective for compensation. To see postmasters are treated with consistency and they receive swift compensation that is fair for claimants and taxpayers. If we scroll down, she continues, we acknowledge that the delivery of compensation to claimants is raising a number of difficult issues given the challenging objective of balancing fair and swift compensation consistently across the claimant groups with making appropriate use of taxpayers' money. We remain committed to working with you to resolve these issues. It then moves on to the fourth priority, effective management of legal costs and settlement with claimants. And if we scroll down, please, we see there the final of those bullet points. It says, work with officials to explore ways in which these activities could be delivered differently, in particular to deliver redress in a timely manner and at a lower cost, alongside continuing to review legal costs and controls. Number 5, if we scroll down, effective financial management and performance. And number 6, over the page, please. Successfully delivering the strategic platform modernisation programme. She then says at the bottom, I look forward to discussing progress against these priorities at our next meeting and in your exit interview. So this was a letter that was sent to your predecessor. It seems as though it was soon before he was leaving the business. Is that right?
Correct.
Can you tell me the date, Mr. Blake? Sorry, I missed
The
it.
actual letter itself is undated. I don't know if Mr. Staunton's able to assist. No. On taking up the role, was this a letter that you had sight of?
And I was also forwarded by Ms. Mumby.
Thank you. Moving on, please, to poll 00448-680.
Sorry, if I could just interrupt for a second, I would just like to highlight the fact that on page 3, there are 3 references to, when it talks about remediation, to fair value for the taxpayer, to appropriate use of taxpayers' money, to be fair not only to postmasters but also to the taxpayer. And I thought that left me with a feeling. This was not a letter that's saying we want to make generous remediation payments to postmasters. It was saying trim it to give fair value for the taxpayers. I found that deeply disturbing, those 3 references.
Being deeply disturbed, was that one of the main things on your mind at the time?
It was on my mind, and certainly was on my mind when I went to see her.
Was it a key priority for you to address when you received that letter?
Correct.
Could we please turn to poll 00448-680? The 11th of November 2022. Here you are writing to the Secretary of State. This is actually before you've taken up the role.
Correct.
It says, I'm writing to ask for your support in addressing a significant risk to the reputation and success of Post Office Limited, namely the retention of the Chief Executive Officer, Nick Reed. As you know, I will become the chair of Post Office Limited on the 1st of December 2022. In preparing for that role, I have identified what I believe to be a critical situation regarding Nick's remuneration package, which I welcome your support to address. This will allow us to mitigate against the risk of Nick leaving the post office in the coming months and the significant consequences this would have for the reputation and future of the post office. My predecessor, Tim Parker, has raised the specific issue of Nick Reed's remuneration with both Paul Scully and with Kwasi Kwarteng over the past year. On both occasions, the ministers declined to approve any improvement in Nick's package. citing concerns over the inquiry and the context of the public sector pay freeze. They indicated that the situation be reviewed again in September 2022 once the inquiry was concluded. However, particularly in light of the extended inquiry process and the subsequent delay in any reporting being published, which means that it may not conclude for at least one more year, I believe that the risks to Post Office are now even more present and that we need to take active control of the situation. As incoming board chairman, I have responsibility to seek action without delay and seek the invaluable support you can offer me. If we scroll down, it sets out there Mr. Reed's current package and remuneration history. We see there the total maximum compensation as at that point in time was $788,500. Could we scroll down? It continues to assess the market position, and then on page 3 sets out proposed action. We see there, paragraph just below paragraph 3, it says, these changes would result in total compensation of $1,125,180 at target performance. This places Nick at around lower quartile of target total cash once the cost of benefits are factored in. So the letter is essentially asking for Mr. Reed to be paid from $788,000 presently now to over £1 million a year.
Correct.
Was this the first communication between yourself and the Secretary of State?
Correct.
If we scroll over the page, we see it concludes, we also hope you will not reject the proposals in this letter as your predecessors have done. In the hopefully unlikely event that you do not feel able to approve the proposal in full, we would urge you to deliver as much of the proposal as possible. Why was it so pressing at this time to address Mr. Reed's pay?
Well, just by way of context, as you say, I hadn't been appointed even as chairman. Normally, in any corporate, a letter like this would actually have gone from the REMCO chairman, and I said surely it should come from the REMCO chairman. But as it was Miss Williams was the CPO at that time, as she said, and as Nick said, the previous letter came from the chairman, so it would look weak if it didn't come from me. So this letter was drafted, and I signed it. There was nothing there that was factually that was wrong. It was obviously just a massive salary increase in a company where it wasn't a normal corporate. It was a public, owned by the public, paid for by the public purse.
It might strike people as odd, of all the matters affecting the Post Office and postmasters, that the very first correspondence with the minister is about Mr. Reed's pay.
Astonishing.
Mr. Staunton, you sent that letter.
I did. As I said, I was asked to sign it. A similar letter had gone by my predecessor. I signed it, and there's nothing factually wrong with it. I wasn't expecting to get approval because I could see what had happened to the previous 2 letters. And of course, I saw the Secretary of State in January, and he turned it down. And I would say in my statement, you've seen a number of issues that arose in respect of remuneration, even between the sending of this letter and my meeting with the Secretary of State, all involving remuneration. It was a very time-consuming part of the work, ridiculously time-consuming.
We've heard evidence from Amanda Burton last week, and I think she identified that it was unusual, perhaps problematic, to have to seek approval from governments to increase the CEO's pay. What's your view on that?
I don't think it is. I think these are huge numbers, as Grant Shapps said, the then Secretary of State, in the context of what Secretaries of State earned, senior people in government. It was a huge amount of money. So I don't agree with Ms. Burton. I think it's quite right that she gets sign-off. Because I think if we hadn't had that, maybe this letter might have gone through. So it was a useful buffer, I thought, for me to hear the concerns, pass them on, and if they were turned down, I thought, well, actually, if I'd been the Secretary of State, I would have turned it down.
Could we please turn to Bays 0000607, please? Actually, could we turn to Bays? That's perfect, thank you. This is your appointment letter from Miss Mumby. I'll just read a few parts of that, please. It sets out 3 priorities. It says, "Dear Henry, congratulations on your appointment as chair. It's a unique opportunity to make a nationally significant contribution." And she sets out there 3 matters that she would like you to focus your attention on. Number 1, effective financial management and performance, including effective management of legal costs to ensure medium-term viability. 2, maintaining and improving the Post Office's capacity, capability and resilience at all levels of the organisation. And 3, engaging positively with the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry and implementing change, including resolving historical litigation issues, successfully delivering the Strategic Platform Modernisation Programme, and reaching settlements with claimants. If we scroll down, she says, "Finally, Tim Parker wrote to me on the Post Office's work to transform the cultural and process aspects in response to the inquiry shortly before his departure. I will write to you on this matter separately." Did you get a response in relation to that matter?
I don't think I did.
Could we please turn to the first board meeting?
Sorry, could I just say,
Yes.
in respect of, say, 1, effective management and performance, including regarding medium-term viability, it was clear to any businessman that to achieve medium-term viability, you need to do radical restructuring of this organisation in terms of reducing the cost levels, etc. So it needed a huge injection of funds from the government if we were to achieve medium-term viability. So you can't just write medium-term viability unless you have the intention of backing the Post Office in terms of investment. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's a really key point which we may come on to later.
And we'll come into the context of your meeting with Ms Mumby in due course. Could we first, though, please turn to poll 00448-621, please? And that is the first board meeting at which you have been appointed, 6th of December 2022. We see there you're listed there as chairman via Teams. If we scroll down, thank you. We see that it was resolved that Henry Eric Staunton, having consented to act, be appointed as director of the company, and then it was noted that the shareholder of the company had appointed Henry Eric Staunton as chairman of the board. If we could scroll down, please. I don't think you made a significant contribution to the actual meeting. I don't think your name is mentioned in all that many places because presumably you'd only just taken up the role. But there is a CEO report, please, at page 3. And it appears that Minister Hollenrake, the then Postal Minister, attended the meeting. Is that correct?
I guess so. I can't recall. But yeah.
The chairman welcomed the minister and passed over to Nick Reed to present the CEO report. Mr. Reed spoke to the report, advising the company had had a very good half year in terms of trade, and that the company's travel and bill payments business had continued to perform well. It then goes on to say that we were seeing a tightening in consumer confidence with a slowdown in banking and travel. About halfway down that paragraph, it says, with the slowdown in the mails trade, a shortfall in our funding over the next few years was forecast. The inquiry, extending now potentially into 2024, was going to cost the company more. However, we wish to support the inquiry to the best of our ability. One of the implications of the inquiry was in relation to the rollout of NBIT, that's the new branch IT system, the technology needed to work first time. The rollout exercise was vast, and the exercise was massively time-bound. This compression of activity within a very short time frame would have many impacts. BT, I think that's Mr. Tidswell, noted that parts of the business were positive. However, the company had significant issues to face, including the inquiry and wider external factors. An issue of some urgency for the board was determining the optimal size and shape of the network, which needed to be coordinated with Bays and the Minister. If we scroll down, we see there SI, that's Saf Ismail, who we've already heard from last week, detailed some of the headwinds for postmasters, including an anticipated increase in minimum wage, rising energy prices, etc. LH, that's Lisa Harrington, referenced the strategic direction of the company and that the board was interested to understand early ideas on the Bays policy review. If we scroll down, we then see that Minister Hollenrake and assistants left the meeting at 2:07. You don't recall?
No, I was getting confused with the date that the minister came, but I recall now he came on that date, yeah.
Thank you. There are no issues addressing compensation being raised with the minister on that occasion, are there?
No.
If we could turn to page 9, once the minister has left, we see the issue of historical matters being addressed. If we scroll down, please. And if we scroll over the page, there's a section there that you have addressed in your witness statement. I'd just like a little bit more detail, if I may. The minutes say, in respect of outstanding balance payments, BT, that's Mr. Tidswell, advised that this issue had been considered many times at the HRC. What was the HRC?
The Remediation Committee.
Thank you. The quandary was that if we notified postmasters and requested they pause payments, were we inadvertently stimulating claims against an unfunded position? Nick Reed queried whether there had been any communications with the current 77 postmasters who were repaying. SR replied, I think that's Mr. Ricaldin, replied that there had not been. Mr. Ricaldin noted that 13 of the 20 cases in this category that had been investigated had shown that the repayments were in order. AC noted that we had not investigated the balance of the other cases. It then says AC advised that he was not persuaded by the argument against pausing repayments, and his view was that we needed to notify and speak to the postmasters in question and investigate fully. I think AC is Mr. Cameron, is that right?
Correct.
Thank you. Can I just clarify the issue here? Was the concern that by pausing repayments that were being made by sub-postmasters, it might actually mean that more sub-postmasters are claiming compensation or redress from the post office?
Correct. I raised this, I put it in my statement, because I used the words that I thought the process was bureaucratic, adversarial, unsympathetic, and one or two other adjectives. And I thought I can't just say that without giving some examples that came to mind. And there were 4 examples I gave, of which that was one. Moving to that one, what surprised me was that we shouldn't be not doing something because it would generate claims. That's not the basis on which the Remediation Committee should be working.
Having received that letter, the strategic priorities for 2022-2023, which you said caused you significant concern in respect of redress and compensation, having then moved to addressing Mr. Reed's pay, is it not surprising that nobody thought at the meeting with the minister on this occasion to raise issues of compensation and redress?
Well, I'd only been in the job a few days, so I think that's asking quite a lot when you're trying to find your feet in what's going on. But as I say, I formed a view over a period of months regarding bureaucracy and unsympathetic and adversarial approach, and that is one example where we shouldn't be making that making that decision, that it shouldn't be based on not having further claims. That's not a good reason for not pursuing something.
So the letter from Ms. Mumby to your predecessor that you said, I think, shocked or concerned you, did that take months to settle in, or was your shock and concern quite instant?
It was quite instant in terms of she didn't say make payments to postmasters that are either generous or seen to be very fair. It was fair, but also make it fair for the taxpayers, or appropriate use of taxpayers' money, etc. So there was a balance here, and I think Mr. Cameron said that in a note of about the 23rd of March that the remediation committee was perhaps too keen to follow shareholders' interests, and these four examples I gave just show that's not, I think, the priority for a remediation committee.
So why at your first board meeting, when the minister was in attendance, were issues of redress and compensation not raised? They were clearly raised after.
I think that's the fact is that, as I said, I've been there a few days. Mr. Reid addressed what he thought were key issues for the minister to hear, and I think that all the things he raised were perfectly fair. I think the feeling amongst the post office was that we're doing quite well in terms of HSS, etc., in terms of getting offers out. Clearly, that's not the view of the postmasters, but as I say, that was the view internally, that we're doing quite a good job, and exonerations, it's not for us, and we don't believe in it anyway. So I think there's a balance here between what the postmasters think, the post office thinks is doing a good job. That's not clearly the view of postmasters, but that was what I think drove them. Why we don't need to raise it to the minister, because things are on track.
Okay, so you have been shadowing since October. This is now your first board meeting. The company's view is things were going okay on compensation. Presumably that was something that you shared at that occasion then?
No, I didn't share it, but I think the answer is it's very early. In your first board meeting, when you are listening to everything, I mean, as chairman, if you're assuming you're in there for 9 years, you have to acclimatise yourself, try and work out what's happening at a board meeting, how things work. You can't, at the first board meeting, just make statements when you're not really sure of all the facts. Don't forget a lot of my other examples that I gave in terms of really a priority that was not being given to postmaster claims were all after this board meeting. So this was the first one. So my thoughts were forming, but they weren't absolutely firm.
Could we please turn to poll 004486676, please? We're now towards Christmas 2022, and there's an email exchange between Mr. Reid and yourself. If we could start, please, on page 3. The bottom of page 3. Thank you. We don't have the email below this in the chain, or we may have it, but it's not showed here. But this is a response from Mr. Reid to yourself, and he says, "Thank you, Henry. This is part of the problem. Non-executive directors attempt to play executive roles, dipping in and out, which causes confusion amongst colleagues. Unfortunately, because Tom," I think that's a reference to Tom Cooper, the UKGI non-executive director, is that correct?
Correct.
Works 4 days a week on post office, he sets a precedent. This needs to change. And your response above is, "In the past, I've had a couple of non-executive directors who have struggled with understanding the difference between executive directors and non-executive directors." In the next paragraph, you say, "Unfortunately, Tom is not inexperienced. He feels he has special status, and I do not think he wants to be helpful. He seems to want to undermine management and to be antagonistic." Can you expand on that, please?
Yes, I mean, it is a very different role, the UK GI representative on this board compared to a normal non-executive. One has to say that on the one hand. On the other hand, it is odd to spend 4 days, that much time, 4 days a week. You're neo-executive, and that is why Mr. Reid felt that the UK GI representative was dipping in and out. And throughout my first year, in all the surveys that we did of when people left, I don't know if we're going to come on to that, but when 3 directors left, I had an independent survey done to find out their views. And the role of the UK GI director was raised as an issue, and it was raised also in the board evaluation report that came out soon afterwards. So there was some dissatisfaction on the board, and I think there probably still is, in terms of the role of the GI director and how much power they have.
And what do you mean?
Equally, it's a very difficult role for that UK GI director, and I accept that.
What do you mean by I don't think he wants to be helpful?
Well, I think he was making a number of points to the management, which I think that they found weren't helpful, that were perhaps off the mark, and I don't think that Tom Cooper saw that as his job, that he wanted that to be helpful.
If we scroll up, another response from Mr. Reid. He says, "That's a fair summary, Henry. My primary issue with Tom is that he fails to fulfil his role, which is to act as an interface between the company and government and to act as a cheerleader for what we do and the value we play in society." Just pausing there, is that an accurate description of the role of the UK GI shareholder, or what it should be?
I don't think it is the role of the UK GI.
What do you see as the role of the UK GI shareholder?
It's very difficult because, as I say, I've never come across anything like it as a role. So I think almost it is what the UK GI director seeks to make it. So, but I don't think it's just to act as a cheerleader, or really as a priority. It should be that. It should be, I think, to make sure that public monies, and there are very, very significant sums involved, are well spent.
He then continues, "Nothing about the way he conducts himself suggests this happens. He has little or no influence in government and doesn't understand the politics. I'm consequently fearful for the next 4 weeks and how we are being positioned in Whitehall." What was the significance of the next 4 weeks? Do you recall?
I can't.
If we scroll down at those final 2 paragraphs on that email, it says, "At the board, he has asymmetric information and therefore an undue influence over everyone, the chair included. He is simply much closer to the day-to-day mechanisms of the business, has an army of analysts to delve into his personal areas of interests, and consequently undue influence. Tim, that's your predecessor, Tim Parker, did duck it. He felt he could influence him. Sadly, no evidence of that. The opportunity and challenge for any incoming non-executive director will be corporate knowledge, history, and how government works. Getting the selection right, of course, will be important, but I'm afraid you will struggle to have an effective and, most importantly, independent board until you address the elephant in the room." What did you understand by that?
Well, there are a lot of issues within there, starting from the back. I realised that fairly early on this was going to be an issue, and actually setting up an independent board that wasn't overly influenced by either UK GI or DBT, or indeed the UK GI nominated director, was very important to establish the independence of the board. And I'm not sure I fully succeeded, but that was always my aim. My predecessor did actually also, Nick Reid is right, did say, "This is a huge elephant in the room, Henry," and I just wasn't prepared to take it on, and you've got this problem to deal with. He did have undue influence, that's fair to say. equally, as I said before, you could see, he felt he had a special role in terms of looking after public monies. So I could see both sides of where people were. They were both right.
Was there considerable frustration at the role of UKGI and its non-executive director as at Christmas time 2022?
Yes, there was, and as I said, I did do an independent survey of the three directors who were leaving, two of them who were leaving before their 9 years were up, and one of them said, it seems like each director round the table has one vote, and it seems like the UK GI director has 10 votes. So actually, we're nothing more than an advisory board. We have no power. Words like a puppet board were used. So obviously, I was worried to hear that. And that's why I thought it's a priority to set this board up as an independent board. But clearly there was dissatisfaction from Nick Reed, and indeed with quite a number of the independent directors. So I actually did go to UKGI and said, look, it's not working. I'm not blaming Tom, but actually I think we need to have a fresh start. And they accepted that. And said they would implement it. It may take a month or two, said Charles Donald, but they did.
If we scroll up, please, we can see your response. You say, I think there is no getting away from the issue. It was the pathway to getting the right result that I was reflecting on, and your email made good sense. I am on the 3rd of January seeing Sarah Mumby, and we'll pop into the office after that. If you are in, we can discuss in specific detail. If we scroll up, please, you've then forwarded that exchange to Mr. Tidswell. And you say as follows, Ben, as the future senior independent director, I want to copy you in on an email received from Nick today. Removing Tom is very, very tricky territory, trickier than Nick imagines. However, it needs to be done, I fear. We will then have a unified board and the execs and non-execs working together to sort out post office's issues. We must get away from the carping, the undermining of management, and the disproportionate influence Tom has over the board. What do you mean by carping and undermining of management?
Well, I think I've talked about it, that he would make his points. Sometimes they were quite detailed points, as a non-exec would see it, and I think as the execs would see it, and therefore they felt he's not running this company, we are. We don't agree with him. We've got to spend all this time dealing with it. So it was certainly a word used by me that that was his approach, and I agree with it. As I say, whilst at the same time understanding the difficulties of the UKGI director. So I wanted a unified board. I recognise how tricky it was. Actually, it was a lot less tricky than I thought. UKGI were very understanding when I said to them, we needed to change, not because I was being critical of Tom. I just think we needed a change, and that would help steady the ship in terms of having a unified board.
It says, Nick, you and I will have to work hard with our 3 new non-executive director colleagues and Brian to have a proper functioning board that knows the difference between the executive directors and non-executive director roles. I know I can rely on you and think Brian can be one round. You will see that Nick has other issues with regard to the role of the UKGI non-executive director, which Tom does not fulfil. I'm seeing Sarah Mumby in early Jan. Will keep you posted. If we scroll up, we have the response from Mr. Tidswell. I agree it will be very tricky, but I also agree it seems inevitable. My sense is that it will require firm engagement at the highest levels, both within UKGI and BEIS. It will probably also fit quite naturally into the suite of difficult subjects we have to broach in the next few weeks, including the funding issues, the network, and Nick's pay. I suspect everyone feels that things aren't working as they should. So it seems that there are 4 issues at the top of the Post Office's priority list at that point in time. First is the replacement of the UKGI non-executive director, which we've seen in that email exchange. And then we come to those 3 other issues: funding issues, the network, and Nick's pay. Is that a fair summary of the position as at the 23rd of December 2022?
No, I don't think it is a fair summary of the key issues we were facing, but there were some of the issues that we were facing.
Why don't you think it's a fair summary?
Well, I think a fair summary, I referred earlier to the fact that when I took the business over, I thought it was a mess. And the reason it was a mess was that it was hugely unprofitable. With respect to remediation, as I say, the government and the Post Office were dragging their heels. There was no appetite for exoneration. We had costs that were completely bloated. We had an issue with regard to cultures and how poorly postmasters were viewed by the organisation. We had a structure that was far too many layers of management, and yet everything came up to the top. No one was taking a decision. We had a culture. We had an issue with regard to governance, and particularly remuneration governance, which we might come on to. So there were a string of priorities, all of them very important. And when I say remuneration, one of them obviously was the Nick pay issue. So funding was important, the network was important, but there were a string of others, and I wouldn't put the network. I would put them. All of the things I've mentioned were massive issues.
We still, by this stage, though, don't see correspondence or communications with government by yourself in relation to remediation.
No,
do we?
I've been in post less than a month.
We then have the meeting with Sarah Mumby on the 5th of January 2023. That document can come down. Thank you. You've said in your statement, it's paragraph 14, that you were aware in your words that Horizon was a completely unreliable system by that stage. Is that right?
Correct.
And you've said that 700 plus convictions of sub-postmasters were suspect, I think was the word you used. Is that right?
Yes.
And you've also said that the redress schemes at that stage were administered in a bureaucratic and unsympathetic way. Is that right?
Correct.
At that stage, what was your concern regarding the bureaucratic and unsympathetic administration?
Well, as I say, you picked up one of the examples. I also referred in my statement to estate duty, where this is where there'd been a death in the family. And we were talking about the principles, and the view was if we widened the principles that we'd open ourselves up to more claims. So I thought that seemed pretty unsympathetic to me. I thought at that same meeting, the legal counsel talked about the duty of care that we owed postmasters, and he said we owe a duty of care to our employees, but we don't owe the same duty of care to postmasters. And I thought that completely missed the point. The postmasters are an integral part of this organisation, and particularly after all that had happened to them over the last few years, to feel that we didn't owe them the same duty of care as we did to our employees, I thought was pretty unsympathetic. I thought we owed them probably a greater duty of care than to our employees.
Will we find that reflected in the minutes?
No, I talked to... my style as chairman is not to pull up people at board meetings. I go and see them afterwards and say, I just don't think that it hits the mark, really, does it? That's what I've done I've been the chairman of a number of companies for many, many years. That's my style. I think it works. And that's what I did in respect of these issues, was chat to Simon, who ran remediation, or Ben Tidswell, in terms of his comments about opening things up to further claims, and to Ben Fote in respect of his comments about not having a duty of care to the same extent for postmasters.
We'll be hearing from Mr. Ricaldin in due course. Do you think that he will give evidence that there was a conversation between the two of you?
Yes.
Which you said we're not getting it right in terms of the attitude towards sub-postmasters.
In that particular issue, yeah.
If we could take your statement onto screen, it's WITN 114-10100. And could we please turn to page 6, paragraph 13. Thank you. It's page 6, paragraph 13. I'm just going to read paragraph 13 out. You say, there were firstly the legacy of the Horizon scandal, which would require the full and speedy exoneration of all the convicted postmasters and appropriate and rapid redress to the thousands of postmasters and their families who had lost so much. Secondly, there was the need to replace the discredited Horizon IT system. It was clear that both would require substantial sums to be earmarked, but I assumed the case for doing so was so overwhelming that the necessary funds would readily be set aside. It was therefore a considerable surprise that when I met the civil servant overseeing the post office early in my term as chairman, I was told that there would be little appetite in government for the kind of decisive and morally imperative action that I believed was necessary. Instead, the message I received was that I was expected to fulfill a more limited caretaker role, overseeing a more modest plan to hobble up to the next election. I addressed this meeting in more detail below, and I'd like to take you to various notes that have been taken of that meeting. Could we start, please, by looking at RLIT 40254, please? Is this your note of the meeting?
Correct.
And I think it's a note that you sent to Mr. Reid on the 6th of January in the morning. And it's a meeting of it's a note of your meeting the day before, is that right?
Correct.
I'd just like to take you through the notes. If we scroll down, thank you, if we start with where it says Sarah. Sarah asked for first impressions. I said I had been on over a dozen public company boards and not seen one with so many challenges. I focused on the financing and network challenges. On financing, we had identified in September a deficit of £210 million. After much effort, we identified savings of £170 million, mainly out of the change budget, cap, and exponentials. However, since then, extra costs of £120 million have arisen. From Horizon, £60 million, training needs, especially with inquiry. Can you just assist us with what that issue was?
The training needs.
Yes.
I can't remember the details of it, I'm sorry.
Might it be that the earlier phases of the inquiry had identified issues with the training of sub-postmasters, and a decision was taken to invest an additional £60 million in training?
That is my guess, but I didn't want to say it for sure, but that's my guess.
Inquiry, £30 million, taking longer, and telephony/internet, £30 million. In total, we have a shortfall, therefore, of £160 million, and this before the deficit arising from the material downturn in downturn in the parcels business, and to a lesser extent from the implications for our cash business of the FCA money laundering regs on deposits. So the issues being raised there in terms of spending appear to be related to Horizon training, costs related to the inquiry, and also additional costs relating to telephony and internet. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, if I could just say from my experience, if this had happened in any other company I'd be chairman of, I'd have blown again. These are huge numbers swinging around. I've never come across a company where you would come across this.
Where do you think responsibility for that lies?
I mean, you could say it was the chairman, but I've just been appointed.
What do you say?
It's management, really, isn't it? Always is.
Fundamentally, what do you see the issue there?
It's a very good question. It's, to be fair, this is a very unusual situation, but nonetheless, I just didn't feel that we really had enough of a grip on costs.
But is that a problem with specific individuals? Is it a problem with anything that you can actually put your finger on, or is it just a it's all a bit too difficult?
I couldn't put my finger on it then. As I said, these are huge numbers swinging around, massive numbers I've never seen before, and it has to come down to management. I couldn't pinpoint a particular manager, but it has to be management.
It then says there was a likelihood of a significant reduction in post offices if more funding was not required. Last year, half of all post offices were either loss-making or earning less than £5,000 profit. The position would have deteriorated substantially because of increase in minimum wage and fuel/electricity prices. A recent survey indicated that 1/3 of postmasters would hand back their keys over the next 5 years, and that figure would now be higher because of extra costs. The reputational consequences for post office and for government were fraught. Sarah was sympathetic to all of the above. She understood the huge commercial challenge and the seriousness of the financial position. She described all the options as unattractive. However, politicians do not necessarily like to confront reality. This particularly applied where there was no obvious route to profitability. What do you understand by the comments being made there?
I think it's a big point that she's making about no route to profitability. I mean, I think if I were a minister, I'd be concerned about pouring good money after bad. So I think it's a fair request to ask for a route to profitability. But as I said, the route to profitability is a fundamental rationalisation of this business, reducing the cost base and, in fact, also attacking the income numbers. But it was not something that would be achieved without big investment and a big reaction from management to get it right.
It continues, she said we needed to know that in the run-up to the election there was no appetite to rip off the Band-Aid. Now was not the time for dealing with long-term issues. We needed a plan to hobble up to the election. Now, those comments appear to be broad comments about funding, not directed towards the matter of redress. What do you say about that?
I think that the comments about the funding that were required for the post office, the big spends were the inquiry, but I think the costs there would have to be what they would be. The costs would relate to Horizon, and as I said to Nick Reed afterwards, that is the one where I think we're most exposed. We really do need to have a much better grip on what these costs are. The third area was funding, was remediation, and the fourth area was just outflows out of the business. And I said to Nick, of the last two, the last one, we've clearly got to get our handle on the cost situation, and on the remediation, I said we should spend what it takes, and I'll take the consequences.
And where in this conversation with Ms. Mumby, in your note of the conversation, do we see the issue of remediation, redress, compensation being raised with?
This, my file note, was not meant to be a full record of what took place. I just wanted to, because we haven't talked about her, my note didn't cover Horizon, for instance, which we ought to talk about. I wanted to record two things. One, that I had told the Permanent Secretary that this business, in terms of commerciality, was a problem child, and secondly, to deal with the other points that I raised. But it wasn't meant to be a full record of everything she said.
So aghast were you by that letter outlining the strategic priorities for 2022-2023 and the references in there to fair value for the taxpayer and compensation? Why do you think it is that you didn't note down any references to compensation and redress in this note?
Well, it's because I thought I was more interested in making the general points that she made, which was there's no appetite to rip off the Band-Aid. Treasury is finding money very, very tight, and as I said, the tightness would be in those four areas, which is Horizon, remediation, the inquiry, and trading.
And where is remediation in the note?
The remediation is not in there, neither is Horizon.
Well,
As
Horizon,
I said, it wasn't meant to be a full note. It was meant to be just recording, A, the trading position to let her know how precarious the position was in respect to the network. And secondly, I wanted to record her overall comments that she made with regard to Band 8 hobbling into the election, restricting spend.
it then says, having said that, we and Bayes needed to do the long-term thinking for a new government of whichever colour. This would include what is politically acceptable with regard to the size of the network. She also referred to operational issues colouring the Treasury's thinking. Trust in the Post Office board and management has not been high. They could see this as another begging bowl request from the Post Office. I said the funding issues revolved around poor decisions made many years ago with regard to Horizon and related legal issues. With regard to the
and the related legal issues, of course, I was referring to that was my reference to Horizon and remediation, the related legal issues.
With regard to the forthcoming meeting with the Secretary of State, she gave some advice. He's nice and easy, but not interested in meetings. He prefers the written form. We should expect him to be pushy and demanding, as he was with the train operators while Secretary of State for Transport. I think this is Grant Shapps by this stage.
Correct.
Is that right? He would hold us to account. He will take a hard line on pay. So far, Sarah's efforts on pay have fallen on deaf ears. So it looks as though, again, there's discussion here in respect of Mr. Reid's pay. Is that right?
Correct.
We then have a note that was taken by the Department for Business. Could we please turn to Bayes 40752? Thank you very much. We can ignore the top email because that, I think, formed part of an investigation into what had been said. So that's dated 2024 at the top. But looking now at the emails that we have on at the bottom of the screen, and if we scroll down, we can see that this was, in fact, a note that was taken and circulated on the 6th of January relating to that meeting. And it says, Sarah met with Henry yesterday. Thanks very much for the support on briefing. It was fairly frank/open conversation in general. I should flag that Sarah opted not to write to Henry prior to the meeting. Read out below, left longer as I think useful. And let's go through the note that was taken by the department. Henry noted he's never seen a corporation challenged on so many fronts. Don't have the luxury of prioritisation, as every issue is a big one. That corresponds broadly with what was written in your note. SM, so Miss Mumby, agreed that challenge is significant and that politics around the post office make this an even trickier problem to solve. The timing of agreeing a longer-term solution this year is also very difficult politically. Noted that we do need to be ready for what that answer is, though. Miss Mumby flagged that the relationship on funding with Her Majesty's Treasury is difficult. Their view will always lean towards the begging bowl type scenario, a dynamic worsened by the Horizon/inquiry costs. Again, that's consistent with your note. Mr. Staunton, Miss Mumby agreed to having a frank and open relationship on the post office. Miss Mumby gave a background to the Secretary of State's ways of working, noting fairly hard, pushy with ALB partner organisations, again, a matter that's addressed in your note. There's then a lengthy section on Mr. Reid's pay. Sarah Mumby, sympathetic to case for Mr. Reid and have been working hard to push this forward. Secretary of State has very hard line on executive pay and haven't so far been successful in getting progress, but have postponed formal decision until post your chat with the Secretary of State. Secretary of State understands risks of Mr. Reid leaving. By this stage, had Mr. Reid said that he was going to leave if he wasn't paid more?
I believe so. There was quite a delay between sending this letter and the meeting of the Secretary of State. And I think it wasn't eating away at Nick, but I think clearly it was important to him. And at that stage, he was clearly wanting movement on his pay. And I've set it all out in my evidence statement, my witness statement. I think by then he was already saying, I'm threatening to leave.
Balancing act in terms of yourself raising it at meeting, given the first discussion with the Secretary of State, so potential for getting off on the wrong foot, combined with relatively low chance of success. And it records your response. You can understand from the Secretary of State's perspective why it's difficult to approve and have already flagged this to Mr. Reid. Reflected that if the permanent secretary can't get progress, it's unlikely he will get much further, and questioned his worth in raising it. Miss Mumby said that if there is a good point in the conversation to land the issue or argument, could still consider raising it, but he isn't going to agree to a full request, still worth trying to get what he can. And it records yourself as keen to be straightforward with regards to Mr. Reid. There's then a section on succession management. Ms. Mumby says the Secretary of State knows problems with internal succession and the management team isn't as strong as could be, so we'll likely raise this as a challenge to fix. What was the issue there?
Well, as I said when I ran through why the company was a mess, I said the management was an issue, and so I don't disagree with Sarah's assessment. So it was a fair point, but this company was in a state of some crisis, so I think it's very easy to be critical of the management. But from the early days, I thought, my goodness me, I've never seen a team having quite so much on their plate, or anywhere near as much on their plate. So I think it's easy to be critical for Ms. Mumby to say we need strengthen the management and it'll all go away. It needed something far more fundamental than that.
Ms. Mumby ran through what we've been doing our side to think about policy options and presumably cost, as the pound sign. Noted 3 difficulties on pounds. 1, we don't have it. Will need to come from elsewhere. 2, in order to give any money, it would need to be approved by Her Majesty's Treasury, who won't allow us to give until we have long-term plan, but the timing doesn't work, so trying to do something to bridge. 3, subsidy control. Without an excuse, we can just lift cash over. We can't just lift cash over the wall. Have to be subsidy compliant, but should be fixable, and is our problem to fix. Ms. Mumby says we might end up doing something small to buy space to collectively to get to the longer term. You both discussed political dynamics of policy options, for example, difficulties in reducing networks. Then says that you mentioned targets referred to in inquiry hearing. Wasn't looking for an apology, but wider point around being synced up and acknowledging where each other's roles lie. Was keen him and Sarah strategically aligned where possible. Now, this does seem to be the first mention of compensation or redress. Do you agree with that?
To be honest, I can't recall quite what she meant about targets in respect to the inquiry hearing, but I assume it was remediation.
I think the issue was, we saw in that very first document that we have seen, there is reference in the original strategic priorities for the department's priority to be an ambition of 100% of offers made at the end of 2022 in respect of the Horizon Shortfall Scheme.
That was the difficult. That's where the apology was sought from the Post Office management, which was actually, they never said they would get 100%. They said they would get 95%. It's to me, it was quite a small issue, but clearly this had been blown up on both sides as to whether it was 100% or 95%. I wasn't interested in getting to the middle of that skirmish.
I think the skirmish related to whether it was a target or an ambition.
Indeed.
As you say, a skirmish about what was said at the inquiry rather than something more substantive.
Absolutely.
We then get on to Ms Mumby, also keen to be aligned as far as possible. They reflected that the level of trust in the Post Office board / management isn't that high, and that funding will come with conditions / scrutiny. That's how HMT work, but agree with everyone playing in correct lane. Then, it once again records, Mr Staunton queried Mr Reed's bonus. Ms Mumby noted in the same place as pay. Ms Mumby, Mr Staunton agreed bad if they have to repay and not worth it for the amount. Mr Staunton thought shouldn't have gone to Ms Mumby in the first instance. Can you assist us with that discussion?
Can't remember what the issue was on the bonus. I don't know if it, and we may come to it, but the whole issue of the bonus that the department were wondering whether the senior management should repay because it had been paid before it had been approved by the department. I'm wondering if that's what it was. Is that what she meant? We might come to it, I presume. Yeah.
Why is it throughout this discussion we don't see any significant discussion about redress and compensation, certainly not in the note that was taken by the department?
I don't think it was discussed at length. I mean, this was she called me in for an introductory meeting. As I said, I'd been in post a month by then. I think you're forming your views. I haven't made up any final views. This is very early days to walk in and start talking about that remediation is going too slowly. At that stage, was too big a call. So I think I was there to listen to what she had to say. And as I say, I mean that file note doesn't record the key things, which was hold on to the purse strings, don't spend any money, hobble into the election, don't take any long-term decisions, don't rip off the Band-Aid. I mean, that was the message that I received from this meeting. None of course, that has been minuted.
If we scroll up, we see considerable time seems to have been dedicated to the discussion of Mr Reed's pay at this meeting. It might be thought that matters of redress compensation and the detail of that is more important than discussion of Mr Reed's pay.
I think if I were a postmaster, I'd be horrified that when their remuneration's going up by 1 or 2% and their costs are going up by more than that, i.e. they're making less money and it's very marginal at best, to see this sort of discussion of moving a pay package to over 1.1 million just for target, let alone for good performance.
Why were you personally dedicating so much time to that?
It was astonishing. I think, firstly, Lisa Harrington and Tom Cooper were very unhappy with what was going on. They just, as I said, we go back to the bonus that had been unauthorized and paid up, and they were very angry about it. They were very angry about the whole way remuneration worked. So I talked to them, and Tom had a very good reading as to the department. He said, "Send it in, Henry, but you get a refusal." So Grant Shapps did turn me down, and I can talk through the events after that in due course.
We started today with the strategic priorities for 2022, 2023, and the evidence that you gave was to the effect that you were horrified by the approach that was taken in that letter to the need for value for money, etc., in respect of compensation issues. You're now meeting with the very person who has responsibility for those issues, the very person who wrote that letter to your predecessor. Why don't we see in either your note or their note any significant discussion of that issue?
Well, as I say, I was called in. It was a listening meeting to hear what she had to say. She didn't specifically raise those issues of the it was her meeting. I just felt that it's a big issue to talk about the role of getting value for money for taxpayers when it comes to remediation for postmasters. But I thought that was a matter that we would need to sort out in due course. It was way too early in my tenure, after a month, to form firm views on what was happening.
To give an idea of the relevant timeline, so far as the inquiry is concerned, on the 6th and 13th of July of 2022, there had been an inquiry hearing on compensation. On the 15th of August 2022, the chair had published a progress report on compensation. You had been attending the board since October of that year. We're now in the new year. Your first meeting with the permanent secretary. Why is it that Nick Reed's pay seems to take a great deal amount of space on the page, whereas compensation, redress for sub-postmasters doesn't?
Well, it was taking up a disproportionate amount of time. I mean, in my witness statement, it took up 10% of my witness statement, talking about what was happening on the chief executive's pay. That just shows how the priorities in terms of pay were to the management.
What went wrong there?
Well, I think what went wrong was that the management feel that this is meant to be more like a public company than a company owned by the state, and therefore the remuneration levels should be closer to that than that of a public company. That, I think, is what went wrong. And to start with, I thought maybe there's something in that, but once I'd seen Grant Shapps, I could tell that's not the way government looked at it. They didn't see it as a company that was more like a public company. They saw it as a company that was owned by the government, and that's why the Secretary of State, Grant Shapps, pointed me towards how much he might earn and how much permanent secretaries might earn versus how much the executives of the Post Office might earn.
I'd like to move on, before we take our morning break, to some early observations after that meeting. Could we please first actually turn to poll 00423699, and this is Mr. Cameron's email on the robustness of our governance that was sent to Mr. Reed. And we'll bring that up onto screen. If we scroll over, please, to the bottom of page 2, it's an email that the inquiry has previously seen in an earlier phase, and no doubt it's an email that we'll see again this afternoon with Mr. Cameron. If we scroll down, thank you. Did you see this email at the time, or thereabouts?
I don't think I did, but I think Alice had chatted me through it, as just part of our conversations.
I'll take you quickly through it. We've already seen it with another witness, so I won't read it all out. We agreed to do a rapid subjective assessment of the issues around our governance, which we might want to fix before we get an expert in. Were you aware of an expert being brought in to look at governance issues at this stage?
Yes, and I was aware that Alistair wanted to have a chance to fix them before we got an expert in who just repeated the fact that we had a problem.
Board membership, we need to get another accountant to support Simon J. Sorry. If we scroll down, group executive, and there's a series of issues regarding the group executive. If we scroll down, 3 was decision making.
If I could just,
Absolutely.
That's quite a big important there. He refers to CIJ.
Yes.
And I think that's quite important to touch on. Will you come back to that?
Well, we can address that now. There's a reference there to the CIJ scorecard. What did you understand by that?
What we had was, if I could just step back a moment.
Yes.
Justice Fraser issued 2 judgments. One was the CIJ, which was mainly around contractual issues, but included some other items. And the HIJ judgment was really 15 big recommendations on how we should move forward. These were really important, and the scorecards were there to try and tick off what Justice Fraser wanted to make sure that we got there. And Alistair's comment here was, actually, that's not what we're doing. We're not measuring the things that Justice Fraser is really interested in terms of losses, rapid buttons for press if you've got a problem, investigations, etc. So he was really concerned that we were not moving in the right direction.
Were you aware at that time of what the CIJ scorecard was?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't aware of it at all. I mean, I was interested because I felt that it was. We'll come and perhaps talk about it later as to the board, as to whether CIJ, HIJ was receiving the right priority. But at that point, I wasn't aware of the detail of what was in the scorecard and what happened, and that we weren't measuring the correct things. It all came out from talking to Alistair.
And at this point in time, did you have a view as to whether the business was appropriately addressing those issues in the historic issues judgment and the common issues judgment?
I didn't have a view. It was before I joined the board, there was a board meeting where they discussed actually implementing the HIJ and CIJ judgments in November 22. Nick Reed reported that we didn't have sufficient funds to proceed both with the Horizon replacement and the CIJ, HIJ recommendations. And Tom Cooper said, well, they're both equally important. But Nick said if there's only room for one, we should move forward with replacing the system. And I said to him, my view is, for what it's worth, I haven't even I've been here a matter of a few days, surely we should fix what Justice Fraser wants. You know, an accountant starts, let's fix the basics, and spending £800 million on a new system, well, we should get to that, but let's do the basics that we can, because that will inspire confidence from our postmasters that we have a system that they can rely on. But as a chairman, you don't take the decisions. The chief executive runs the company. That's very important to understand. You're there to guide thinking, nudge, and only in the last resort overrule. So I thought, well, I've raised it. I think it's for Nick to think about, and in the end he thought about it, and actually the priority was the MBIT system. It's not what I would have done if I'd been chief executive, but that was the view that was taken.
So the decision was to prioritise the new Horizon system
Correct.
Over implementing
Justice Fraser's
matters
recommendations.
raised by
Yeah.
Mr. Justice Fraser. Can you assist us approximately with what kind of time period that was when that decision was taken?
That was at the board before I joined.
Thank you. We get to the NBIT system at point 4 of Mr. Cameron's email. He says as follows in respect of NBIT: we've not had any formal governance of NBIT for months, and there is no date when we can expect it. The group executive has no idea, for example, why R2 has been delayed. Is that a second rollout of some sort?
Yes.
Or the extent to which it matters. No one is working on how we run the post office after NBIT. What was your understanding of the concerns regarding the NBIT system at that stage?
They were very, very real. They were very, very real as far as Alistair Cameron was concerned. Normally with these big projects, you have an executive committee that really gets into the detail, and you have a board committee that looks at it more strategically in governance terms, make sure that the exec committee know what they're doing. And the executive committee was abolished in about November, as I recall, and that's precisely why Alistair raises the problem, and it wasn't set up for months. And he says in a different memo, it's reckless. And I said to Nick, we really have to have an executive committee that runs this. But there was no executive committee right the way through to the half year, and I was getting feedback from other people for Alistair saying, look, there's a problem building up here, the costs are out of control. And sure enough, in June, we were informed as a board that the project, instead of costing 330-odd million, it was going to cost 840 million. I mean, that is an indication of how staggeringly out of control this project was. So I think Alistair's probably not, is being a bit kind to say what he said.
You've mentioned a decision in June, or information that was provided to you in June.
Correct.
In your statement, you also refer to an incident in May of 2023, where you say Jane Davies had spoken to Mr. Cameron, and there's an allegation there that the full exposure had been hidden from the board. Can you assist us with that allegation?
Well, only to the extent that I think Alistair's view was that the truth wasn't coming out, and at the same time, shortly after, we had that John Doe letter which said exactly the same thing, and I guess none of that would have transpired if we'd had an executive committee that was meeting fortnightly astride this project. It's normal, basic project control of a big project like that.
And we'll get to the John Doe letter, but do you, in your opinion, is it your evidence that there was something intentional about the lack of information being provided to the board?
That would be what was happening within the IT department. I think that there probably was an intention for the picture not to emerge. But I have no evidence for that. That would be my gut feel. You cannot have a project going from just over 300 million to just over 800 million without some intention to hold back that information.
Thank you. We'll look at one more document before we take our mid-morning break. That's POL 004478666. And this is the board evaluation report that you referred to earlier. We're now at the 28th of March of 2023. And was this a document, a report that you asked to be created?
No, it's a normal annual evaluation where we contact the non-execs, well, contact all the board directors and one or two others to get their views on governance.
Thank you. There are points raised or areas for development set out there. The first is regarding board agendas. The second is the relationship between the group executive and the board needs to be strengthened and priorities aligned. There was concern about insufficient information flows between the two groups. Briefly, what was the concern there, and was it a concern that you shared?
Yes, I think, to be honest, it's the real issue was for the directors that we get these very lengthy reports which are difficult. There's just too much to read. And the main issue was that they were being asked as board directors to take a decision. And that's very unusual. Normally in a board, the executives take the decision and they bring it to the board for approval, which is very, very different. And I think that was the issue about the information. It was information on, but not in the way they would have expected to receive it.
Thank you. 3, the board needs time to review and reflect on its past decisions, and customers' views need to be considered further when the board is making decisions. And 4, the board would like clarity on the shareholder representative's role on the board. Does that go back to the December 2022 discussion that you were having regarding the UKGI non-executive director and the limits or extent of their role?
Partly, but it also, for me, confirmed what had happened from these 3 directors, one of whom left after 9 years and the other 2 who left before their time was up. And I got an independent review done by Ernst & Young as to their reasons for leaving. And they said, look, we're about to leave. That makes it very invidious for us. And I said, well, look, I'll tell you what, talk to Ernst & Young, and I, on a purely private basis, because I need to know, as a matter of record, why 2 of you are leaving early, really. And one of the issues that emerged, the key issue for me, they mainly emerged actually after talking to them about the report, was the issue of the UKGI director. So it wasn't a surprise to see this thing arising in this report.
If we turn to page 3, it sets out there the lowest scoring questions. There's also a section on the highest scoring questions. If we scroll down, look at the lowest scoring questions. To what extent does the board review past decisions? 2.3, so that the 2 a score of 2 means that the area requires development. 3 is good or at the required standard. If we scroll down, please, how would you assess the board's approach to considering the following stakeholder needs / views when taking decisions? Customers, again, 2.3. How seriously does the board take the development of individual directors and the board as a whole, and where it needs to improve? 2.5. And it's these last 3 that I'd like briefly to focus on. How effective are the relationships between non-executive board members and management in providing support and challenge? 2.8. What do you see as the concern there?
Well, as I said, I hadn't been there long, but it clearly came out that there were relationships between the non-executive and the management weren't quite as good as they would be normal in any other company I'd been with.
The level of insight provided by the UKGI representative into the strategic direction that the shareholder aspires to, 2.8. Is that much of the same that we've been discussing in relation to UKGI? Yes. Finally, how would you rate the quality of papers and presentations received by the board? Again, 2.8. Again, was that something that a concern that you shared?
It's the point I made. It was not so much the well, it would depend really by quality. It was the issue was too much decision making was required by the board, and all of this should be done at the top management level, if not below.
Can we please turn to page 11? And there are some open comments there in response to the question, how effective do you consider past board evaluations to have been, and do you feel the recommendations arising from past board evaluations have been implemented with sufficient rigour? I would like to look at those last 2 bullet points. First, with a new chair, I expect there'll be some shift towards greater challenge and accountability of senior management. Was that a concern that you were aware of when you joined, that there was a concern about the accountability of senior management?
I don't want to be critical of my predecessor, but I felt that was the case. I'm a fairly proactive chairman in terms of getting things done, and that's probably fair. I saw that as an issue.
There is a concern that the Post Office Board lacks independence from its shareholder. The shareholders' views are ostensibly given more weight than other non-executive directors or directors. The Post Office Board should act in the best interests of the Post Office, and it may have regard to its shareholder interest, but not at the expense of the Post Office. It's not always clear this is being done. Again, is this much of the same in terms of the...
This is the 10 votes versus 1 vote situation.
Thank you. So that might be an appropriate moment for us to take our mid-morning break, please.
Certainly, yes. What time shall we resume?
If we could take 15 minutes, so that's about 47 minutes past.
All right, fine.
Thank you. Still moving chronologically, can we please turn to poll 004487112? And this is the Chief Executive's report to the Board of the 6th of June. That will come up onto screen in a second. Thank you. The narrative states as follows. There can be little debate that the period since my last board report has been one of the most challenging for the Post Office in its recent history. A combination of the TIS submetric issue, that's the bonus issue that we discussed with Ms. Burton, combined with the racial codification scandal, as well as legal challenges to the historic shortfall scheme, has put the organisation on the back foot reputationally as well as politically. It is also unlikely that this will cease in the near term. The Select Committee hearing at the end of the month, along with its publication of Amanda Burton's report, will ensure we remain in the media's spotlight. It is as yet unclear what approach the government proposed to take with their remuneration governance review, but it is unlikely to be positive. The implications of all this should not be underestimated. A fragile and brittle business is creaking. Morale is being severely tested. A culture of fear is developing. It is this final point that we should be especially concerned about. Colleagues are fearful of putting their heads above the parapet, of taking risks, and soon of admitting mistakes. Risk aversion and paralysis is setting in, which will not help our commitment to transparency. Was that a view that you shared?
Yes, it was.
And as at the 6th of June 2023, what in particular were you doing about it?
I think I ought to make plain the role of the chairman, because you asked a lot of questions about remediation. Why weren't you doing something about it? I just want to make sure that it's fully understood that the chief executive of any company runs the company, is responsible for everything on a day-to-day basis. Everything comes up to him. The chairman's role is, if he's not satisfied that sufficient progress is being taken, you challenge, you nudge, you try and clarify thinking, but in the end, you're under no. You fully understand as the chairman that the chief executive is running the show, and if in fact you're unhappy with the way it's running the show, there's only one option, which is you find a new chief executive. But you're not running it, and I just want you indicated that somehow I was running the company. That's not the role of a chairman, just to be clear. So on something like this, I was aware of it, and we talk about it. I understood what was happening, and the answer is, what do we do about it? And that's what I talked to the chief executive about.
So you see the role of the chair of the post office to talk about a significant problem where there is a culture of risk aversion and paralysis setting in, and your solution to that is to talk about.
No, that's not fair. The answer is that if you're not running the company, you make suggestions as to what what Nick ought to think about doing. But it's not a question of talking. You make suggestions as to how you tackle the problem. But it's for the chief executive to tackle the problem and sort it.
And what were the concrete suggestions that you made to Nick Reed to resolve the very serious issues that he highlighted in his annual report to the board?
Well, his monthly report to the board, yeah. My main concern, as I touched upon it right at the beginning, which is we have layers of management and no one is taking a decision. Even before this culture of fear, decisions were not being taken at the right level. Everything was being passed up, and there was this fear, possibly, and this is what Nick said, possibly because of the inquiry. That they were fearful of making decisions because they might be up to give evidence. I found that unlikely because we weren't talking about a level of management where they would come before the inquiry, but that was his view, and that was part of the explanation. We've just got to get through the inquiry and things might normalise. I think that it was more than that. This business is not fleet of foot the way I would other retailers, Granada, W.H. Smith, the way they would tackle it. It wasn't fleet of foot in that sense, and I wanted to talk to him about my experience at Smiths and how we might make the business more fleet of foot. And of course, a lot of this thing comes back to, if you have commercial success, a lot of bits fall into place. So I was actually very anxious to think, if we're successful, people will feel confident about what they do. They'll feel they have a secure job because the business is expanding. And that actually is also part of dealing with this culture of fear.
Am I to understand from the answer you've given then that your answer is that the way to address the problem here is greater commercial success?
That's part of it, without any question. That always lifts morale in any company. If you're doing well, it's amazing what difference that makes to people taking decisions, not being fearful, etc.
And would you say
not the only reason, but it's without question, in my limited experience, it's a factor.
And are there any other concrete suggestions that you made at that time in order to resolve the problem?
I can't remember the detailed comments, but there's no doubt it was a big issue, and I think that Nick, not unreasonably, felt that this was not going to be solved immediately. It needed a longer-term issue. It came out even in the evaluations that we did, staff surveys. I've never seen, even with top management, we did the survey, that culture of fear and worry. So this was something that was not going to be sorted without a lot of thought and a lot of movement on all fronts.
Is there anything over and above thought and movement that you would suggest could resolve those problems as at that time?
Well, I can't remember the detail of it, but you know, the fact is it needed to be dealt with on a number of fronts. And I didn't feel that the management were being slow in that regard. I could quite see that with the lack of commercial success, with the inquiry, etc., why people were fearful. I understood that.
Let's move to the John Doe letter that you've referred to already in your evidence. It's Pol 00448 It's an anonymous email, subject whistleblowing, and it's direct to yourself. I'm writing to you directly because I don't trust the post office whistleblowing process, and escalations into Nick Reed have not been dealt with. This email will also be sent to Sir Wyn Williams and Darren Jones. The disaster of NBIT is well known across different levels within the business. Recently, a number of people have raised concerns to Nick Reed and have been ignored. More than one individual is aware and has told Nick the board have been told untruths by the NBIT team and CIO about the extent of defects and timescales for R2 rollout that now won't be delivered until August, if then. Were you aware of those issues when you received this email?
Yes, I think I explained before that I'd had feedback from Alistair in May that things were being hidden. Well, it goes right back to the fact that we didn't have an executive committee for some months, so that wasn't good project control. So when Alistair said that there was a problem brewing in May, I fully expected that. I wasn't surprised. And then, of course, Nick reported to the board in June. This is when the project moved from 340 million to over 840 million. So it was all about this time. By the time of this note, I was aware the project was looking at, with contingency, over £1 billion. I mean, I was obviously shocked by it, and as you would expect.
The next paragraph, there has been no governance in place for NBIT for a long time, and what has been in place hasn't done what it's supposed to. Even the new steering group operates on misinformation because no one really has a clue what's going on, how long it will take to fix, and can't be open about how broken the programme is because it's already gone too far. Was there a feeling within the business that it was now effectively too big to fail?
No, I don't think that was the case. I think that I can only my view and the view of my fellow directors was this was an appalling situation to suddenly within 3 months have a project to be costing over £1 billion when we thought it was going to be at 300 million before. So, but I didn't think there was not a feeling that it was too big to fail. As I put in my witness statement, the answer is we needed to have at £1 billion, we need to have a rethink about what on earth was going wrong. And Nick Reed and I agreed that the monthly spend needed to be slashed while we took stock of where we were. Just to explain, if I could, with NBIT, there was we had to take the decision was taken before my time, which was should we have a system built off the shelf or have it done specifically for us, and then if it's done specifically, should we do that in-house or by some experts? And Post Office had taken the decision that we would do a specific system built in-house. That was the most risky route to take, but that route had been taken by the time I got there. Once we had this £1 billion number thrown at us, we agreed that we would get Accenture in, get them to do a review of what should take place, and that's what happened. And Accenture felt that what the Post Office was proposing, which was to have it built in-house on our own, was actually the right decision, although they recommended a partner, i.e. Accenture, should hold our hands going forward. As you'll see from my witness statement, I was a bit sceptical because I said I was concerned that the consultants were talking the project up, and to a certain extent the management, the IT management, were influencing the consultants. So even though I got the Accenture report, I just had in the back of my mind that they were just saying press ahead, and I wanted to know if there was a cheaper solution, which I did talk to the CIO about it at some length. So it wasn't as if, trying to explain to you, as if nothing was done when we saw this £1 billion. The answer is quite a lot was done.
Let's continue scrolling down. It says the NBIT project team and RTP teams work in silo. NBIT are secretive and told not to share updates or information with anyone from the wider business. The RTP team are being stood up to understand gaps in the NBIT plan that should have been managed under the CIO and NBIT director. Was anyone being held accountable at this stage within that team?
Yes. Mr. Reid felt that the NBIT director probably just wasn't coping, and we needed to make a change.
Can we scroll over the page, please? Setting up two separate projects under different leaders had been a colossal mistake from Nick, which he did despite being warned against it by the CFO and others. It has led to fighting and openly combative and negative behaviours from some of his group executive and other senior leaders. Were these kind of views isolated? Were they views that you were aware of more broadly? Did this take you by surprise?
I'm not sure. I didn't agree with the fact that it was wrong to have two separate leaders, and I know we've now gone to having one team, but actually the RTP team really was to take, their responsibility was to take a system developed by the IT team and implement it within post offices. It was a totally different set of skills that were required. And we had a manager called Kate Secretan who was just fantastic, but she couldn't have written an IT program, but she could really deliver on what goes on at the post offices. So I didn't disagree with having two teams because of the skill sets required. Equally, once you have two teams, there's always a degree of bickering, and you have to make a management decision as to the pluses and minuses of those two.
Scrolling down, there is inefficiency across the business, but especially in the transformation, retail, CIO and NBIT teams. If we scroll down, the CIO is the worst leader I've experienced in a long and successful career. He's open about misleading the board with inaccurate dates and costs for NBIT and is incapable of making a decision or having a difficult conversation. Was that a view that you were aware of or that you shared?
Well, clearly, when you see a project go up to £1 billion and £300 million in the course of 3 months, clearly something's being hidden from you.
If we scroll down over the page, please. Retail path clearing is an expensive and time-consuming activity that needs to be delivered before the new system can roll out. But this is the day job of the retail team, and nobody with the ability to fix it seems to be questioning why they've not been doing what they should be, or why the retail director isn't owning fixing it now. And then there's a section there that addresses Mr. Reid. It says, Nick Reid has openly acknowledged and accepted the failings of some of his group executive team to more than one employee. That's been to him to express concerns, but has taken no action to deal with it. He's also aware of toxic behaviour from senior leaders and again does nothing to address it, even when he's witnessed it directly. He refuses to make the difficult decisions and nods along when people raise concerns, saying everything they want to hear, but then does nothing to resolve it. He's aware he has a senior people in a role not doing what they should, like Jeff Smith, and again does nothing to manage or deal with it, even though it's a waste of public money. Was this a view that you were aware of or shared?
Yes, probably. Yes.
Yes to both? You were aware of it and you shared it?
Yes.
The culture in the business is discussed.
Although I say that, that is my perspective. It is fair to say that this was an incredibly complex decision, the Horizon decision. So I would put that in mitigation in terms of my criticism.
The culture in the business is disgusting and starts from the top with Nick and the group executive. More than one person has heard comments from Mr. Reid about public school education, and there's a class, race and gender divide at the top. We have a chief people officer suddenly disappeared from the business who happened to be the only female in his team. Now, without identifying any individuals involved or anybody who has been a whistleblower, broadly looking at this paragraph, what is your view?
We had a huge cultural problem. Certainly, even when I joined, there was only one female in the executive team, which I said to Nick, that's just doesn't fly. Ethnicity was very poorly represented across the team. You heard odd comments about jobs for the boys. I'd heard them and understood why those comments were made.
What do you mean by that? You understood why those comments? Oh, why these comments?
Because, we did have a problem with ethnicity. We did have a problem with gender.
Nick made comments last week to the senior team about the horrific behaviours of the people who were part of the Horizon debacle, especially if they're still in the business. He doesn't seem to see how much of this is still going on, and it feels like he's doing exactly what these people did before saying, if you were here in the past, you need to go regardless of the situation. Now, we've heard about Project Phoenix and the Past Roles Project. In your view, as at this time, was the business doing enough in respect of those people who were involved in the underlying issues remaining in the business?
The underlying issue with regard to Horizon was we didn't have an executive committee managing in a normal project control sort of way what was happening. That was what was wrong. So there was no, if we'd had that, we would have, these issues would, no doubt in my mind, would have come to light. So, a lot of this would have been dealt with. Most of it would have been dealt with.
And I know you don't like the question, what did you do about it? But can I put that again? What did you do about it?
Well, I thought I'd said, really, which, as I said to Nick, never in my experience have we not had an executive committee running a project like this. I did institute a board committee, an investment committee, so there was this overview of what should take place, and Andrew Darfour agreed to chair it, and he's a very, very, very competent person. But the fact is that a board committee doesn't work unless you've got an executive committee reviewing these things on a day-to-day basis.
What about the fundamental cultural issues that are addressed here?
Well, that's a different issue at all. That's got nothing to do with Horizon.
Yes. And what were you personally doing in respect of those fundamental issues?
Well, I think that you will have seen the evidence given by Saf Ismail and Elliot Jacobs as to how hands-on I was with regard to dealing with the issues of postmasters and how we should treat them. And of course, there's a big ethnic issue within that. So I was doing a lot in that area. I think with regard to the Horizon, it is a project, and really a project has to be managed by the executive. So if there are issues that are being hidden, if there's a feeling that there are too many public school jobs for the boys, it's for the management to sort out. And I said to Nick, that's what we need to do. And if we had a proper executive committee, it would get sorted out.
Could we please turn to poll 00448-509? There's then a discussion at board level on the 5th of July about the letter. If we scroll down, we can see there's a heading, Speak Up. And if we see below, it says the chairman shared his view. Some of the allegations raised did not appear to be strictly whistleblowing issues, and that it may be in order for the board to consider a different approach to address those allegations.
And that is because some of those issues were to do with competence and management rather than whistleblowing, which is to do with more cultural type issues.
We see below that, if we scroll down the page, Mr. Reid addressing the board. Now, given that some of those cultural issues were directed towards Mr. Reid's own abilities, do you think that the board at that point scrutinised those cultural issues sufficiently?
Well, with regard to competence, the board felt it was up to them to form a view after a review as to whether we felt the competence was right. And that is why we agreed to appoint Accenture to give us a view on all these things. So we didn't do nothing. We actually felt that would deal with competence. If it was to do with cultural, well, that should be part of the investigation into Mr. Reid, which it was.
We have KPMG involved by this point, Accenture involved by this point. We're
Correct.
going to move on to Grant Thornton also being involved by this point. What is your view as to whether the Post Office farmed out these issues to too many external agencies and didn't deal with it themselves?
I think that's a really good question. In my experience, I've never seen an organisation that uses consultants so much by a factor of 5. It's a really good question. It's very unusual, and it would not happen in a normal corporate. It's absolutely right.
You personally did instruct a number of those organisations, or were involved in the appointments, should I say?
Well, I didn't. I was keen for Accenture to give the board an independent view, and I was keen for Grant Thornton to be involved on governance type issues. Yes, that's right. But I'm talking just more generally.
If we could turn to the Grant Thornton report, that's at poll 004464777. We see over the page it was commissioned in October 2023. So were you personally involved in the commissioning?
Correct.
Yes. We turn to page 7, and we see there the key findings. The inquiry's been through this report already in the key findings. Are there any in particular there that stand out for you that you were concerned about? I appreciate that this wasn't published until a year later.
Yes. Well, I think a key one is the first one, which is actually everything stems from having a proper group-wide strategy. I think, and my view for the strategy, which I touched on with the Secretary of State on the day she fired me, which was we needed to have a far more postmaster-centric organisation with more postmaster on the board. It would change our culture in terms of how much we spend. We'd be farming out a lot less to people and spending public money in that area. And I think what I saw was a slimmed. This was only a viable business if we slimmed it down significantly, but that would require funding. So it was the key issue for me, without doubt. Just looking down there, I think.
Could I ask you about number 5? 5 is culture, a lack of trust, accountability and performance management. Post Office is plagued by a pervasive culture of reluctance to make decisions driven by fear of public scrutiny. Now, this very much echoes the observations made by Nick Reid that we looked at earlier that were made in June 2023.
Yeah.
It looks as though by the time this report of the 25th of June 2024, so a year later, that was still a problem within the business. Do you think that under your chairmanship, sufficient was done to address that issue?
Yes, I think we were trying to deal with it. I think, as I said before, the management structure was all wrong, and it just encouraged this reluctance to make a decision and performance manage, and everything was moved up in a business. I've never seen that in a business before. There are a number of cultural issues. The biggest cultural issue, of course, relates to how postmasters are viewed in this organisation. We could probably come back to that.
Well,
and
we'll come to it
I thought what was
chronologically in due course. And let's stick with the timetable. We're in October now when this report has been commissioned. Let's move on now to November. Could we please turn to poll 004486994? We're now in November. If we scroll down, actually, if we could go to bottom of page 2 into page 3, this relates to something called Project Venus. Briefly, do you recall Project Venus as a name?
Is this to do with the postmasters? Yeah.
Yes, so let's have a read of that, the bottom email. It's an email from yourself to Simon Jeffries, who was a board member. Was he the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee?
Yep.
Actually, if we scroll down, we can see his email to you. And he says, I was made aware of this project this evening. It would be helpful, please, if you could update me before the Audit and Risk Committee on Monday. Happy to give you a call tomorrow if convenient. And then we see your response, and you address the investigations into Mr. Ismail and Elliot Jacobs. You say, the balances with Elliot, as with so many postmasters, is problematic, partly reflecting the complications with Horizon. A summary of the saga is as follows. A detailed investigation was undertaken by the investigation team, and a balance of under £15,000 was agreed as owing by Elliot. This built up over a period of 6 to 10 years, bearing in mind that about £1 million a year goes through the intercompany account. The difference built up over a period of years, i.e. de minimis, is de minimis. So essentially you're pointing out there that the money owed by Elliot Jacobs was, in your view, de minimis, given the period and given the amount of money passing through his accounts.
No, these were not, that's precisely the point, these were not loans to David Jacobs. What we had here, as with any retail organisation, we had a difference on an intercompany account, just to have with any supplier relationship. This did not, and it's £200,000, but even £200,000 is de minimis in terms of the amount of business going through Jacobs' account. So it was, in any normal organisation, you just done a reconciliation of intercompany accounts, which eventually we did, and we found that only £15,000 or so was owed by Jacobs, which was infinitesimal in terms of the business going through. But what had happened was that the legal department did a complete investigation into these two postmaster directors. I think it was vindictive. I think it was to do with them raising issues with regard to postmasters generally, and it was completely out of order. And what we had was a situation was, even though when we found it, I think Sir Wynne said it took a year to do this investigation, and the answer is it took a year, but actually it could have been done in months, but it was held over these two poor people for a year. That's why I say it was vindictive.
If I could stop you there, were you surprised that the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, by this stage, after a considerable period of investigation, wasn't aware of this issue?
Well, it's because these investigations, as part of our procedures, are not made public, because these people, as it turned out, these people were completely innocent. So we just wanted to find out what the position was. Now, what happened was the legal department, as part of this, the word's not vendetta, but as part of this attack on the postmaster directors, was saying these were loans to directors, when they clearly weren't. It was just intercompany trading. That's why I pulled you up on the word loan. This wasn't a loan. This was intercompany trading and nothing more. And they said somehow that the reduction from the £200,000 to the £15,000 was a benefit in kind. It wasn't. It was, the fact is, the Horizon system was lousy and was giving these wrong figures, and we could only prove £15,000 that was owed. So there wasn't an issue.
You then say, Foat spent a considerable amount on legal fees. I asked a subcommittee of Lorna, as the shareholder director, and Amanda, a lawyer, to look at the legal advice. Saf and Elliot have a feeling that Foat will just not let it go. He keeps raising the matter that somehow Elliott and SAF had an undisclosed conflict of interest. I gather he said that to you.
Yes.
They deeply resent that. They say it shows the post office has not changed, in that they think all postmasters are crooks. It's getting heated now. When I thought he had cooled the situation weeks ago, I thought the whole matter had now been finalised following Amanda and Lorna's review, but it seems that Fote opened a second front with you. I have not seen the note that is being considered, so I'm unsighted on what is proposed. SAF and Elliott are obviously concerned that a note will lead to, is that a freedom of information request?
Yep.
Which they think is Fote's aim. They think that the matter has been investigated fully and the balance found to be owing is de minimis, and a Freedom of Information Act request will just allow Fote to pursue his vendetta. Very strong words at this point in time being used in relation to Mr. Fote. By this stage, November 2023, were you aware of an investigation into your own conduct?
No.
If we scroll up...
Can I just pick up on one thing, though?
Yes.
Which was, and this is not just being 100% supportive towards the postmaster directors. When the £15,000 was found to be owing, the post office agreed with Mr. Jacobs that he could just add that to the intercompany account and deal with it that way. And I said, no, I want you to write out a cheque, so I don't want any doubt that there's no loans to a director here. And they said, well, we've agreed what we're going to do at the post office. I said, nonetheless, I would like you to write out a cheque. So it's not a question of just siding with the postmasters. I took a firm line on that.
If we scroll up, we can see that exchange of correspondence with Mr. Jeffries. He asks for some more information on the top of page 2 because of the difference in the figures. And then if we go to the first page, we can see you give a more detailed explanation in respect of those figures.
And you can see that the chairman of the audit committee agreed.
Yes. Now, we do know that by this stage there was an investigation into a whistleblowing complaint that had been raised by Ms. Davies. But can I confirm that it is your evidence that by this stage you were not aware that it concerned you?
Correct.
You've suggested in your witness statement that the investigation into the sub-postmaster non-executives may have had some sort of ulterior motive. Can you assist us briefly with that, please?
Well, I believe, and so do the postmaster directors, it was because of their comments about the unsatisfactory cultural issues within the company that the postmasters have got their hands in the till, guilty until proven innocent. You would have seen all of those issues raised by them, and I think they felt that this was, in their view, some sort of payback vendetta.
As I've said, we're also at this time, the company is dealing with the allegations made by Ms. Davies, the Chief People Officer, or the former Chief People Officer. The inquiry isn't investigating every aspect of that complaint, and the reason the inquiry has named Ms. Davies is because she has been previously publicly named in respect of this issue. In terms of timing, if it assists your answers, the Speak Up complaint for Ms. Davies was made on the 4th of September 2023. And Ms. Davies is said to have named you as part of, albeit not the main complaint, but as part of that.
No, she didn't name me at all. I wasn't named in that.
I'm coming to it. On the 10th of November, it is suggested that she is subsequently said to have named you as an individual who had made a discriminatory comment at a meeting with external recruiters. As I say, we're not addressing every single issue in today's hearing, but in terms of timing, it does seem as though by the time this happened and the concerns that you've raised there in vociferous terms regarding Mr. Fote, she had by that stage named you.
But I wasn't aware of that. Can I just say that Miss Davis, as she said to the Select Committee, this was a complaint by her into Mr. Reid and Mr. Reid alone, and she has said in writing that she thought this investigation was weaponised against me following my support of the postmasters.
In terms of notification to you then, when is it that you believe that you were notified that you were the subject of that investigation?
I think sometime in December.
Thank you. Looking at the timeline again, the ITV drama was the 1st to the 4th of January 2024. So we're now moving to early 2024, and there was a letter that was sent to the Lord Chancellor. By way of background, could we please look at poll 00448-701, please? This is a letter from Nick Vamos, a partner at Peters & Peters Solicitors. I think the actual letter is undated, but it must be prior to the letter to the Lord Chancellor, which is the 9th of January. He says as follows: I wasn't sure who within the post office currently is engaging on this issue, but I assume you all are. Was this a letter that came to you at all?
No.
Do you know who it went to?
I assume Mr. Reid and Mr. Reid alone.
I've been listening with growing concern over the weekend to the report that Alex Chalk, who was then the Lord Chancellor, is actively considering stripping the Post Office of its role in appeals and or using legislation to overturn every conviction. I assume he's considering the HCAB, that's the House of Commons, recommendations in their 14th of December letter and attachment. My concern is not that the government will implement any of the recommendations, but that it will do so on a false basis because it does not have all the relevant information and advice. It needs to determine whether it will increase the number of successful appeals.
Sorry, Mr. Blake, to interrupt, but isn't HCAB the Horizon Advisory Board, not the House of
Absolutely.
Commons?
My apologies, sir.
That's fine.
The most significant issue is that all the HCAB recommendations and the recent media and political response is based on the false assumption that there are 700 wrongful convictions. Therefore, there are hundreds of miscarriages of justice still out there whose route to justice is somehow being thwarted by the Post Office and the system. In reality, it is highly likely that the vast majority of people who have not yet appealed were, in fact, guilty as charged and were safely convicted. Unless this is made clear to the government, it risks making incredibly important and expensive decisions on a completely false premise. I'm sure that this point has been or is being made to whoever is briefing Alex Chalk, but I also know that points can be misunderstood or watered down by the time they reach a minister, and this is one point that cannot be made strongly enough. He then identifies other issues. The second issue relates to the Crown Prosecution Service, unlikely to be taking a more generous approach than the Post Office. Third issue is that there are still many cases that need to go via the CCRC, and it has rejected 31 applications based on clear confessions and or other corroborating evidence of guilt. Fourth issue is the unspoken assumption that the Court of Appeal Criminal Division would overturn more convictions if only the Post Office would let it. And then if we scroll down over the page, please, the letter ends as follows. Please let us know if you need assistance from Peters & Peters in ensuring that the government has a clear and comprehensive picture of all the relevant issues in its current decision-making process. If it does not, or they are not presented clearly, I'm very concerned that the outcome of the decision-making process will not be in the interests of justice, PFAs, or POL. Were you aware of this a request for this letter having been made, or do you know if it was volunteered? Do you know the background at all to the production?
Nothing of it.
Was it something that you have discussed with Mr. Reid?
I hadn't discussed with it at all. But I was absolutely horrified when I saw this, because we were getting absolutely nowhere on exoneration for postmasters based on a very faulty system, and I was in some despair. And then the dam broke with the Mr. Bates programme, and we were getting somewhere. And you'll see I wrote to Nick Reed very early in January and said, there's some progress happening here. Nick was slightly more in the guilty as charged camp, whereas I was in a different view. So I said, well, let's just keep out of this. It's a hugely difficult decision for the government to make in terms of exoneration. Let's let them make it. And I thought we'd agreed that. So when I saw this letter going to Alex Chalk, I just thought that should have gone to the board, because it was actually expressing a view that I'm not sure that I didn't share, and I don't think most of the board did. I did write to the minister, and I said thank you for all the comments you made in Parliament the previous day in respect of exoneration, and I'm hugely grateful for your support.
Let's have a look at the ultimate letter that was sent. The inquiry's seen it before. It's poll 004483881. This is the letter to the Lord Chancellor from Mr. Reed. If we look at the second paragraph, it welcomes the publicity generated by the ITV drama. But it says we also have a duty to the court in respect of our role as prosecutor in some 700 of those cases which resulted in convictions. The paragraph below says that they have carried out an exercise to identify which would be highly likely to concede in court, and this has enabled us to write proactively to a further 30 potential applicants, in addition to the 142 resolved cases and the 5 awaiting consideration. But then the paragraph below sets out the natural corollary to the exercise, which has been to identify those cases in which, on the information available to us and following the judgment in Hamilton, we would be bound to oppose an appeal. Typically, these cases involve convictions obtained by reliance on evidence unrelated to the Horizon computer system. The number of such cases is very much more significant, at 369, with a further 11 still under review. So the suggestion being put there between those two paragraphs is that there are 30 potential applicants in addition to the 142, but the number that they would oppose significantly higher. Is that your understanding?
Yes, about half is what they said. If I could just step back a bit. At the January 2023 meeting, KC, acting for the Post Office, Ms. Gallifan, came to the board, and I asked her specifically, why are so few people coming forward? And she said, well, there are a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that they may be guilty, but she gave a whole lot of other reasons, which I thought were perfectly reasonable. But it's interesting that Mr. Tidswell, who's the chairman of the remediation committee, said the reason they haven't come forward, if they haven't come forward by now, they're probably guilty. And the Post Office, we as the Post Office, have a duty, that was the words, we have a duty that those who are found guilty remain guilty. And that sent a chill down my spine, because that was the beginning of the year. That's why I was in despair. I thought, how on earth are we going to get exoneration back on the map? And it only came with Mr. Bates. So it gives you some understanding of the feeling within the board, particularly the chairman of the remediation committee.
And will we see in the minutes of meetings you voice that concern?
No, again, as I said, my style was to say to Ben, that doesn't make any sense. They quoted 550 cases at that January board, which they were looking at in terms of exoneration. They said there were only 12% that might be considered. And I said, that doesn't make any sense that only 12% were based on Horizon. As you saw, they're now admitting that it's up to half were based on it. So these quiet words do make some progress in terms of moving the numbers.
But you're chairman of the company, you're chairing the board meeting. Isn't the board meeting the time to say, hang on a minute, we've got this approach entirely wrong?
The issue is managed. We have a separate remediation committee chaired by the senior independent director. He reports to the board, and we take a view on what he said. He's got the feel for it. But I would say that the majority of the board probably shared my view that this probably didn't make any sense, but the detail was being handled by the remediation committee. So I think it's very difficult as a chairman when you've got your senior independent director saying there's a duty for them to be remain guilty.
Mr. Staunton, this isn't a matter of detail. This is a matter of fundamental culture.
Absolutely.
And why, as chair of the Post Office, were you not at this time making the feelings that you have expressed today in your evidence? Why were you not making that known at board level? This
was in January 23, a month after I'd been on the board. As I said, that would be ludicrous at that point to have that firm a view.
So sorry, Mr. Staunton, I'm getting confused about dates.
Yes.
I assume that this discussion that Mr. Blake is suggesting to you that should have been occurring at a board meeting was in 2024, just after Bates v. the Post Office had broken.
Yes, so when I was just trying to give some background as to what was the position a month after I joined in terms of...
Yes, but we're a year on from that, aren't we?
Okay, but I hadn't related to explain that situation, which was the feeling. I was trying to give a background to where people were coming from at that point, which was the case in December. That's why.
Okay, but we're now in January 2024. We have a letter from the CEO to the Lord Chancellor as almost as high up as you can possibly go in terms of correspondence. Yeah. What were you doing at board to make known that you had fundamental concerns with this approach?
I don't think there'd been a board meeting since the letter from Nick Reed had there to...
Did you send an email saying, I totally disagree with this letter, why did you send it?
I did. I think it's on the email trail, isn't it? Nick, we agreed that this was not you're expressing a view from the post office, which you know is not my view, and this should have had board approval. So I did do that precisely. And there hadn't been a board. There was going to be a board the week after I was fired, where that was firmly on the agenda.
Looking broadly at the culture at the post office at this particular time, could we please turn to poll 004486999? This is the same day as that correspondence. Could we turn to page 6, please? There's an update on the discussions in Parliament. As you may know, the Post Office Compensation Bill is short, fairly technical piece of legislation that essentially looks... this is from the December. What we're going to see in due course. So there's an update. It starts with an update on the Post Office Compensation Bill. If we scroll, please, to the page 4...
I don't think I was copied on this note, was I?
No. I'd just like to ask you really about... You're copied on the first... Sorry, this chain is ultimately sent to you, and we'll see on page 1 in due course. But if we start on page 4, we can see on the 8th of January, so the day before that letter was sent, if the bottom of the page, we see, as you will know, the Minister provided a statement in the House of Commons this evening on the Horizon compensation and conviction update following media coverage of the Bates drama and mounting pressure. If we scroll down, we can see concerns being raised there in the second paragraph. Although the Minister did not have a substantive update on compensation, he did note that he had met with the Lord Chancellor, Alex Chalk, today, and together they've devised options to work through outstanding convictions with much more pace, but noted the Lord Chancellor would need to speak to senior members of the judiciary for advice first. So it looks as though there's movement towards the exoneration.
And that's why I replied to the Minister thanking him for his efforts.
Thank you. And if we scroll now to page 1, we see an email from Mr. Foat, which is copied into you, so that encloses the entire chain. And it says as follows: in addition to my note on Saturday setting out a range of points on legal, governance and comms, I do think it might be worthwhile that a one-page fact-checker is drafted. There are a number of facts that are actually erroneous in the media, i.e. that all convictions are unsafe, etc. If it's such matters are overtaken by a political decision and legislation, I believe it will be important to have an accurate position of why it was that the government and the post office were in this position, i.e. Court of Appeal Criminal Division, not all 700 are unsafe convictions based on Hamilton. Current legal rules mean that the convicted claimant must bring the appeal. It's not up to the post office to just overturn all of them, etc. In your view, what was the view of the executive, the legal team, and the wider business at this point in time in relation to the possible movement by government to provide a blanket exoneration?
Well, my view is that there was no propensity, no interest at all for overturning convictions, it's sad to say. Whereas that was not my view. I thought these convictions of these poor postmasters and their family were based on a completely unreliable system. And it was obvious to anybody, I'm not a lawyer, but it would be obvious to anybody who's not a lawyer that was just an incredible decision. So we got to the right decision eventually, but it was not one that had much support within the executive of the post office, as you see from Nick's letter and you see from Mr. Foat's letter.
We then get to the 13th of January, and I think this is the email that you're referring to, in which you expressed concerns about the letter. Could we please look at poll 004487003? 13th of January. You say, "Dear Nick, thank you for forwarding your letter to Alex Chalk as requested. I was surprised to read it following our conversations that we would not become involved in any way in what is a very difficult decision for government and our justice system. You say that we are not making a value judgment, but then attach a letter from our lawyers which makes the statement, it is highly likely that the vast majority or postmasters who have not yet appealed were in fact guilty as charged. If there is not a value judgment, if that is not a value judgment, I do not know what is." He also makes another value judgment that no one would have a more generous approach to than the post office, a view I would not share based on my assessment of our past behaviour. A third party would see this letter as post office's lawyers continuing to defend the indefensible. Post office has not changed, etc. That assessment of others would do a huge disservice to the efforts of the current board and management team as we seek to accelerate justice and generosity for wronged postmasters. Please ring me over the weekend to discuss. So you do very clearly, as at Saturday the 13th of January.
Crystal clear.
Crystal clear. It might be said against you that by that date you had an invitation to be interviewed in relation to other whistleblowing complaints, the Miss Davis complaint that we have referred to, and that in some way perhaps that played a role in you suddenly reacting in this way with such a strong tone. What's your view of that?
Well, you saw the evidence presented by the postmaster, Neds, who said that I was absolutely consistent. These are absolutely consistent with my views explained throughout this process.
Could we please turn to poll 004483002? We're now on the 14th of January, and as you say, we're now getting to the Project Pineapple incident and your involvement with the non-executive directors. Could we please turn to page 4? This is an email exchange that we have seen in the inquiry. Am I right in saying, in fact, where it says 10th of January, it should read 14th of January? So it's just after you've sent that email, I think, to Mr. Reid, the day after, the Sunday after. And this notes your views as, it records the views of Saf, Ismail and Elliot Jacobs. SAF said the views expressed by Richard Taylor and previously by management and even members of the board still persisted, that these postmasters who had not come forward to be exonerated were guilty as charged. It is a view deep in the culture of the organisation, including that postmasters are not to be trusted. Something needs to be done. What was your view on that issue?
I totally agreed.
Martin Roberts and certain members of his team were singled out. There had been no feedback on the investigation into Roberts, including for inappropriate behaviour and lack of integrity. He was responsible for the postage stamps debacle, where changes were made to accounts by his team, just like Fujitsu. If Elliott had not been on the Audit and Risk Committee, the controls would not have been strengthened. Roberts and his team did not want any extension to their terms of office, as they believed new postmasters would not have the experience to challenge them. Again, what's your view on that?
That's slightly more detailed, and I was much less aware of these issues of postage stamps debacle, etc. It was all news to me, but Elliott said, if he hadn't raised them at the audit committee, things would not have been done. I didn't understand the detail of it. I put it in there because I wanted these two to know that everything they'd said to me reflected their views.
Thank you. And then we get on to a section on Mr. Fote. Equally, Saf and Elliott are fed up with the amount of power wielded by Fote. He and other members of the senior team act as if postmasters are guilty until proven innocent. We must also part company with all those investigators who behaved so terribly with postmasters. Again, by this stage, what were your concerns with regards to Project Phoenix and the Past Roles project?
There are these people called the Untouchables who are in the investigations team or Reds or whatever, and they were involved in dealing with all these issues in the past, finding postmasters guilty. I think it's very important for the inquiry to understand this is not something that relates to the past. This is something that relates to the future. Before we implement Horizon, we will be doing a path clearing exercise. There are millions of pounds in dispute between postmasters, what's on their records and versus what is in the post office's account. And I am very afraid that if they are investigated by the so-called untouchables, we will have another debacle, not quite to the same extent, but we could never have hundreds of postmasters again having to pay out monies. And I think it was referred to in some of the correspondence that you may have seen with Elliott. But this is not something that relates to, this is a big issue going forward, the involvement of the untouchables. And
you refer to them as untouchables. Is that a word that you had heard used?
No. It was. I think it was used by Nick to me privately, and he did refer to it in a meeting we had with all of the non-execs there, and that's why I was slightly surprised when he said he didn't recognise the term.
And what did you understand him to mean by that term?
I think I understood him to mean that these people that were involved in prosecuting past postmasters previously, they were still in their roles and therefore would be involved in any future investigations and were under we classified all of these people under various colours, and they were the same as the so-called Reds, i.e. would be involved in future investigations, which just seemed utterly wrong.
If we scroll down, we have the reference to a small amount of £16 in compensation being paid to one postmaster. It then refers again to the 48 people involved in investigations, and I think you record as being told by Mr. Ismail and Mr. Jacobs that there were 40 just like Mr. Bradshaw. It then says, as a board, we need to send a signal to the executive, providing guidance and improving the culture. Significantly, the culture was described as toxic. Again, this is your record of the note of that conversation.
The most important one is the paragraph you've missed out, which is they say, the postmaster is not the enemy. That's vital to understand.
Yes, so that's just above the highlight. The postmaster is not the enemy. Only postmasters can solve this and tell us how to change. JB, I think that's Mr. Bartlett, is an ex-policeman. His behaviour has been unacceptable and needs to move on to prove we have changed. Now, I have to put it to you, because others have made this suggestion, that your interest at this point in time in these pineapple issues, in the letter that was sent by Mr. Reid, is prompted in some way, because at this stage, at this point in time, you yourself were under investigation in relation to those allegations.
Well, let me go. This investigation was an investigation primarily into Mr. Reid. There was one sentence that referred to me, so I was absolutely very confident that I had nothing to fear. It was a 12-page report by Miss Davis, and she had an 80-page dossier to back it up. And the only sentence, there was one sentence in it with regard to me, so I wasn't concerned at all. Moving on to the Project Pineapple report, it was a Sunday night. I was at home. I didn't prompt them to do it. They rang me with their concerns. There was nothing more. And I said to them, firstly, I said to them, this is very tricky for you chaps. You know the post office as much as I do. This will have serious consequences for you. You could end up losing your businesses. And they said, Henry, we feel the right thing to do is to bring this out into the open. So it was their initiative, and I think they were very courageous to do it. So I said, I will send a note to the board just highlighting your points. It won't be a formal report, but I'll just for discussion, and I will want, if there's a single word in this email that you don't like, I won't send the email, and I want both of you to agree to every single word. And they both came back to me and said, that's exactly what we said.
Thank you. If we go over the page, we can see the final point there as well, regarding postmaster membership on the REMCO. One final document before we break for lunch.
That's really important, sir, if I may say, so that the postmasters directors feel that they're treated as second-class citizens, so they're not on important committees like REM, and that's important. They refer to a two-tier board, and when I've said to them, are you referring to the two tiers with regard to just the two of you not being treated with respect by the management, or is it because you have this inner cabal of Miss Grattan, Miss Burton, and Ben Tidswell versus the rest of the board? And they say, well, sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. So here's me desperately trying to keep this board together, and yet there are these issues about some people feeling not involved. But the fact is, we need postmasters on boards like the REM, because it'll bring a different perspective to what is a reasonable salary to take, because postmasters think 800,000 is a lot of money per year, let alone 1.2 million.
We're going to look at one more document before we break for lunch. I'm afraid we will go over lunch today. Could we please turn to poll 00448-303?
While that's coming up, Mr. Staunton, can you just tell me who decides which directors sit on which subcommittees?
The NOMSCO decide, the Nominations Committee. The Nominations Committee decides, but the chairman also has a view on it. I did actually talk to Mr. Reid about why don't we have a member of one of the postmaster directors on it, and he said, well, they just wouldn't take a commercial view of what is the right salary, because of course they come from the postmaster environment. But
yeah, I wasn't delving into the merits of the particular.
It's the Nominations Committee, sir.
I just wondered who made the decision. That was all.
The Nominations Committee.
Fine.
They would take some notice of the chairman in terms of that, but it would be the Nominations Committee.
So the Nominations Committee, but the chair can seek to exert influence. Is that a fair?
Yes, that would be a very fair way of putting it. But they would listen very carefully to any views I had.
Yeah, okay.
If we could start on page 2, please. There's an email from Mr. Jacobs to Melanie Park, who was the Central Operations Director, and we've seen this email before, he was waiting for his finalised report in respect of the investigation that was going on into his branches, and that's the 16th of January. if we scroll up, we can then see that he sends that concern to you. And you say, below you'll see correspondence from between myself and Mel Park regarding the fact that his trading account has not yet been updated with the removal of the invalid claims of losses, nor a letter of withdrawal of the investigation to be issued. Who is responsible? Legal. Again, how are legal in the way of all things progress and good in the business? Proof, if proof were needed, that their fingers are in every part of the pie affecting our ability to get work done to such a level that it's frankly beyond belief. You then respond, and it's your response that I'd like to focus on it. You say, this is completely unsatisfactory. I was under the impression after talking to one of the non-executive directors handling this, that the report was wrapped up many weeks ago. I understand the tremendous upset you and SAF in the case of his investigation have been subjected to. This requires an investigation. I've sent a file note of the views of our postmaster non-executive directors with regard to Ben Fote. We should see tomorrow whether our non-executive director colleagues should take action. I told Andrew yesterday that all of the group executive and 4 board member directors had been investigated. He was incredulous. Can you assist us with that? At that point in time, what were those investigations that were going on? We've heard about the 2 non-executive sub-postmasters being investigated. The suggestion here is that all of the main board directors had also been investigated.
No, there was obviously Nick was being investigated, I was being investigated, you had the 2 postmaster directors, so that was the 4, and the senior management team, most of them have been subject to investigation. It's difficult to comprehend. This was completely and utterly unusual, the power of the legal department to investigate people.
So we have, by this stage, all of the group executive, 4 board members. We also have, as a background, the falling out in respect of that letter that we saw to the Lord Chancellor. Everything that's going on at this point in time, it looks like a bit of a circus, doesn't it?
Well, the issues around the GE, that was all much earlier in the year. So this was not something, the circus at the time, but it just shows the power that the legal department had over months and months and months. So it's not all happening in December, but the fact is there's no getting away with it. From January, following the Lord Chancellor letter, following the Richard Taylor letter saying all the postmasters got their hands in the till, just outrageous stuff. The fact is that January was the most turbulent month that I've had in my whole 50-year career in business, and particularly in all the years I've been a chairman. I don't deny that.
What do you see as fundamentally having gone wrong by that stage?
There were to have a position like that, there are all sorts of strands. One, of course, is the role of GI and the UK GI director. There's the role of the legal department. Clearly, there's an issue around Nick and I trying to keep this show on the road, but I think we both were working incredibly hard in that respect. Even 3 or 4 days before I was fired, I wrote to Lorna Grattan saying, look, Nick here just feels totally unsupported. This is a terribly turbulent time for the business. We do need to give him some more support, because a lot of these issues, you're saying it's almost self-inflicted, but these are coming from out. The Richard Taylor thing was coming from left field, as it were, as was, of course, the Lord Chancellor situation.
Thank you. So that is an appropriate time to take our lunch break. Could I ask that we come back at 10 to 2?
How's the shorthand writer with that?
Yes. Yes.
Right, 10 to 2.